On the morning of June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in human history erupted along the beaches of Normandy. More than 150,000 Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel, determined to break Hitler's grip on Western Europe. For Nazi Germany, it was the beginning of the end. Across occupied France, German commanders rushed to move reinforcements toward the invasion zone. Among the most feared formations ordered into action was the 2nd SS Panzer Division, better known as Das Reich. For years, the division had built a reputation as one of the Waffen-SS's most experienced and ruthless combat units. It had fought in Poland, France, Yugoslavia, and on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. Its soldiers were considered elite by Nazi leadership, but they also carried a dark legacy. Wherever the division had been deployed, reports of reprisals, executions, and attacks against civilians followed. When the invasion of Normandy began, Das Reich was stationed around Montauban in southern France, hundreds of miles away from the beaches where the decisive battle would unfold. Adolf Hitler wanted the division to move north as quickly as possible. On paper, it seemed simple. In reality, the journey became one of the most infamous marches of the Second World War. Before understanding what happened during that march, it's important to understand what Das Reich actually was. The division belonged to the Waffen-SS, the military branch of Heinrich Himmler's SS organization. Unlike the regular German army, known as the Wehrmacht, the Waffen-SS was deeply tied to Nazi ideology. Its officers and many of its soldiers were expected not only to fight but also to demonstrate absolute loyalty to Adolf Hitler and the racial doctrines of National Socialism. Although Waffen-SS divisions often fought effectively on the battlefield, the organization itself became closely associated with war crimes committed across Europe. After the war, the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg declared the SS a criminal organization because of its central role in persecution, mass murder, forced labor, and crimes against humanity. Membership alone did not automatically make every individual guilty of a crime, but the organization itself had become inseparable from the Nazi regime's system of terror. Das Reich had earned its reputation long before 1944. The division first saw combat during the invasion of France in 1940. Later, it participated in Operation Barbarossa, Germany's massive invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Fighting on the Eastern Front exposed its soldiers to an increasingly brutal war where prisoners were often executed, villages were destroyed, and civilians became targets. Anti-partisan operations frequently blurred the line between military action and collective punishment, leaving entire communities devastated. By the spring of 1944, Das Reich had been withdrawn to southern France to rebuild after suffering heavy losses in Russia. New recruits arrived alongside battle-hardened veterans. The division received replacement tanks, armored vehicles, and equipment while preparing for the expected Allied invasion. Then, on June 6, everything changed. As news of the Normandy landing spread across occupied Europe, German commanders issued urgent orders for armored divisions to move toward the front. Das Reich was expected to reinforce German defenses before the Allies could establish a secure foothold. But the journey north quickly turned into a nightmare. French resistance fighters, known collectively as the Maquis, had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. Acting under instructions coordinated with Allied intelligence, resistance groups sabotaged railways, destroyed bridges, cut telephone lines, and ambushed German convoys. Every delay bought valuable time for Allied forces fighting in Normandy. Instead of advancing rapidly, Das Reich found itself constantly slowed by sabotage. Entire railway lines had been blown apart. Roads were blocked. Fuel supplies became difficult to move. Convoys faced sniper attacks. German commanders grew increasingly frustrated. Within the Nazi command structure, resistance attacks were rarely viewed as legitimate military operations. Instead, they were often labeled as acts of terrorism requiring severe retaliation. The policy was already well established. German occupation authorities believed that collective punishment would discourage civilians from supporting resistance fighters. Villages suspected of helping partisans could be burned. Hostages could be executed. Entire communities could suffer for the actions of a few individuals. As Das Reich advanced through central France, that policy became deadly reality. The first major tragedy unfolded in the town of Tulle. On June 7 and June 8, local resistance fighters launched attacks against the German garrison there. During the fighting, dozens of German soldiers were killed. Some captured Germans were also executed by resistance members. When elements of Das Reich entered Tulle on June 9, they quickly regained control of the town. What happened next was not a battlefield engagement. German forces rounded up hundreds of civilian men from homes, streets, and workplaces. Many had no connection to the resistance whatsoever. They were assembled for inspection while officers selected individuals almost at random. 99 men were chosen. Throughout the afternoon, they were taken to balconies, lampposts, and other public locations across the town. One by one, they were hanged. The executions continued for hours. Residents watched in horror as neighbors, fathers, brothers, and sons were left hanging in full public view. Another 149 men were deported to German concentration camps. Many never returned. The massacre at Tulle sent a clear message to occupied France. Any resistance against German forces could bring devastating consequences for entire communities. Yet even greater horror was only one day away. On the morning of June 10, 1944, soldiers from Der Führer Regiment, a component of the Das Reich division commanded by SS Sturmbannführer Adolf Diekmann, entered the quiet village of Oradour-sur-Glane. Located in the Limousin region of western France, Oradour-sur-Glane had largely escaped the violence affecting other parts of the country. It was a peaceful farming community with approximately 650 residents. There had been no major fighting inside the village. No significant resistance force was operating there. Many local families believed the war was passing them by. Around lunchtime, German troops surrounded the entire village. Roads were blocked. Nobody was allowed to leave. Using loudspeakers and shouted orders, soldiers instructed every resident to gather in the village square for what they described as an identity inspection. The order included everyone. Men, women, children, even elderly residents. People obeyed because refusing German orders during occupation could itself be dangerous. Within a short time, nearly the entire population had assembled. German officers checked identification papers. The atmosphere remained tense but relatively calm. Few imagined what was about to happen. Then the separation began. Men were divided into several groups and escorted to different barns, garages, and storage buildings around the village. Women and children were directed toward the local church. Families were torn apart within minutes. Many believed the separation was temporary. Parents reassured frightened children. Husbands told wives they would meet again after the inspection. Those promises would never be fulfilled. Inside the barns, German machine guns had already been positioned. According to survivor testimony and post-war investigations, soldiers did not initially aim at the heads or upper bodies. Instead, many fired at the victims' legs. The wounded men collapsed onto one another, unable to escape. After the shooting stopped, soldiers spread combustible materials throughout the buildings. They then set the structures on fire. Anyone still alive was burned inside. Only a handful of men managed to escape through extraordinary luck despite serious injuries. Meanwhile, inside the church, hundreds of women and children waited anxiously. Exactly what happened inside has been reconstructed primarily through the testimony of the sole adult survivor, Marguerite Roufange. She later described panic as smoke filled the church after an explosive device or incendiary materials ignited inside the building. As flames spread, terrified mothers tried desperately to protect their children. Those attempting to escape were met with gunfire outside. By the time the violence ended, the church had become an inferno. The village itself was then systematically looted and burned. Homes, schools, shops, farm buildings. Virtually everything was destroyed. When the killing finally stopped, 642 people had been murdered. The victims included 245 women, 207 children, and 190 men. Entire families disappeared in a single afternoon. Infants, teenagers, grandparents. None were spared. The destruction of Oradour-sur-Glane quickly became one of the most infamous atrocities committed against civilians in Western Europe during the Second World War. Even within the German military, questions emerged about whether the massacre had served any legitimate military purpose. Some German officers reportedly criticized the operation privately, while others attempted to justify it as retaliation against resistance activity, despite the lack of convincing evidence that Oradour itself had been a major resistance center. News of the massacre spread rapidly after the war. Photographs of burned vehicles, collapsed buildings, and the ruined church became enduring symbols of Nazi occupation. Unlike many destroyed towns that were rebuilt on the same site, French President Charles de Gaulle made an extraordinary decision. The ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane would remain untouched. Instead of rebuilding over the ashes, a new village would be constructed nearby. The original streets would stand forever as a memorial to the victims and as evidence of what had happened there on June 10, 1944. But while the village lay in ruins, the men responsible continued moving north. Their mission had not changed. They were still racing toward Normandy, where one of the largest battles in military history was already underway. What they did not yet realize was that the road ahead would become a battlefield from which many of them would never return, and that the crimes committed in France would follow the division long after the guns of World War II fell silent. As the smoke still rose from the ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane, the armored columns of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich continued their march toward Normandy. Their orders had not changed. Hitler demanded that every available armored formation be thrown against the Allied invasion before it could expand beyond the beaches. Every hour mattered. But every delay gave the Allies more time to unload troops, tanks, ammunition, and supplies. By the time Das Reich finally reached Normandy, the strategic situation had already shifted against Germany. What should have been a rapid deployment became a journey lasting nearly 2 weeks. Sabotaged railroads, destroyed bridges, Allied aircraft, and constant attacks by the French resistance had slowed the division far more than German planners had expected. Military historians still debate exactly how much these delays affected the Normandy campaign, but there is broad agreement that the resistance significantly complicated German movements at a critical moment. When Das Reich entered the fighting in mid-June 1944, it encountered an enemy unlike any it had faced before. The skies belonged almost entirely to the Allies. Every daylight movement risked attack. American and British fighter bombers constantly searched for German vehicles. Convoys that attempted to move along open roads were frequently bombed or strafed. Tanks, trucks, fuel carriers, and supply vehicles became easy targets. German crews quickly learned to hide beneath trees during the day and move mostly at night. Even then, they were never truly safe. Despite these conditions, Das Reich remained one of Germany's strongest armored formations. Equipped with Panther tanks, Panzer IV's self-propelled guns, armored half-tracks, and experienced veterans, the division launched repeated counterattacks against British, Canadian, and American forces. Some of the fiercest fighting occurred around the towns of Caen, Saint-Lô, and the rolling countryside known as the Norman Bocage. The bocage favored defenders. High hedgerows divided fields into natural fortresses. Visibility was limited. A tank could be destroyed from only a few yards away. Every field became a separate battlefield. Both sides suffered terrible losses. For weeks, Das Reich fought desperately to contain the Allied advance. Individual German units often displayed remarkable tactical skill. Experienced tank commanders repeatedly ambushed Allied armor. Infantry fought from concealed positions. Counterattacks temporarily slowed the Allied advance. But tactical success could no longer compensate for Germany's growing strategic collapse. The Allies possessed overwhelming advantages. Their factories produced tanks faster than Germany could replace them. Their aircraft dominated the skies. Fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements arrived continuously from Britain. Germany, meanwhile, struggled with shrinking resources and increasing shortages. Every destroyed tank became increasingly difficult to replace. Every experienced crew lost could not easily be trained again. By late July, the balance finally tipped. On July 25, 1944, the United States launched Operation Cobra. After an enormous aerial bombardment, American forces broke through German defensive lines west of Saint-Lô. The breakthrough transformed the entire campaign. German defenses began collapsing. Instead of holding fixed positions, many units, including Das Reich, were forced into continuous retreat. Then came the disaster that effectively destroyed Germany's remaining strength in Normandy. In August 1944, Allied forces attempted to encircle the retreating German armies near the town of Falaise. The resulting battle became known as the Falaise Pocket. Thousands of German soldiers found themselves trapped. Roads became clogged with tanks, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, artillery pieces, and desperate civilians attempting to escape. Above them, Allied aircraft attacked almost without interruption. Bombs exploded across crowded roads. Rocket-firing fighter aircraft hunted armored vehicles. Artillery shelled escape routes. Columns stretched for miles. Burning vehicles filled the roadsides. Dead horses, shattered equipment, and destroyed tanks created scenes that many veterans later described as apocalyptic. Das Reich fought desperately to escape the encirclement. Some elements succeeded. Others were annihilated. Much of the division's heavy equipment had to be abandoned. Many tanks were destroyed either by Allied fire or by their own crews to prevent capture. Thousands of experienced soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Although the division technically survived, it no longer resembled the powerful armored force that had marched north in June. The retreat continued across France. Paris was liberated on August 25. German forces withdrew toward Belgium and eventually into Germany itself. For Das Reich, the months that followed became a series of defensive battles. The division fought during Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands. Later it participated in the Battle of the Bulge during the winter of 1944. That offensive represented Hitler's final major attempt to reverse the war in the West. Initially, German forces achieved surprise. But once again, shortages of fuel, overwhelming Allied air power, and fierce resistance doomed the operation. By early 1945, Germany's defeat had become unavoidable. The Soviet Red Army advanced relentlessly from the east. American, British, Canadian, and French armies pushed from the west. German cities were under constant bombing. Industrial production collapsed. Fuel shortages crippled armored formations. Even elite Waffen-SS divisions struggled simply to keep vehicles operational. Das Reich continued fighting during the final months of the war, but it was now a shadow of its former strength. Many experienced officers had been killed. Veteran non-commissioned officers were gone. Replacement soldiers often had only minimal training. Equipment shortages became severe. Some armored vehicles could no longer be repaired due to the lack of spare parts. Others simply ran out of fuel. When Germany officially surrendered on May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended. For surviving members of Das Reich, a new chapter was about to begin. Some became prisoners of war. Others attempted to disappear into civilian life. A number destroyed documents identifying their SS service. Some claimed they had merely followed orders. Others insisted they had never participated in crimes against civilians. But investigators across Europe had already begun collecting evidence. Witnesses from Tulle. Survivors from Oradour-sur-Glane. Captured German documents. Military reports. Photographs. Testimony from former SS personnel. All would eventually contribute to one of the largest investigations into wartime atrocities committed by the division. Yet despite the enormous scale of the crimes, bringing individuals to justice proved extraordinarily difficult. Many records had been destroyed. Numerous suspects were dead. Others escaped into occupied Germany before investigators identified them. Some blended back into civilian society under their real names. Others benefited from the growing political tensions of the Cold War, as Western governments increasingly prioritized rebuilding West Germany over pursuing every suspected war criminal. The division itself ceased to exist. But its history, and the unanswered questions surrounding accountability, were only beginning. In the years that followed, courts would examine the massacres committed by Das Reich. Some officers would be convicted. Others would never stand trial. A few would receive surprisingly light sentences. Several would live out the rest of their lives without ever being punished. The story of Das Reich did not end on the battlefield. Its final chapter would unfold inside courtrooms, archives, and memorials, where survivors spent decades fighting to ensure that the crimes committed in occupied France would never be forgotten. And perhaps the most unsettling question remained. How could one of the most infamous divisions of the Second World War leave behind hundreds of murdered civilians, yet see so many of its members escape justice? That question would shape the investigations, and the controversies, that lasted for decades after the war had ended. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the fighting ended, but the search for justice was only beginning. Allied investigators and French authorities began collecting evidence from towns devastated by German occupation. Among the most infamous cases were the massacres at Tulle and Oradour-sur-Glane, both linked to elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich. One of the central figures in the Oradour massacre was SS Sturmbannführer Adolf Diekmann, the commander of Der Führer Regiment. Ironically, he never faced trial. Just weeks after the massacre, Diekmann was killed in combat during the Battle of Normandy on June 29, 1944. His death meant that one of the principal officers connected to the atrocity was never questioned in court. Another senior commander, SS Brigadeführer Heinz Lammerding, survived the war. French courts later sentenced him to death in absentia for his role in the crimes committed in France. However, Lammerding was living in West Germany, and the West German government refused to extradite him to France. As a result, he was never imprisoned for the massacres. He died in 1971, having escaped French justice. The most significant post-war case came in 1953, when a military tribunal in Bordeaux tried members connected to the Oradour massacre. 21 defendants appeared before the court. Some were German volunteers in the Waffen-SS, while 14 were men from the French region of Alsace who had been forcibly conscripted into the German military. These conscripts were known as the malgré nous, meaning, against our will. The trial quickly became controversial. Survivors demanded severe punishment, arguing that innocent civilians had been murdered. In Alsace, however, many people viewed the conscripts as victims themselves, forced into German service under threat of imprisonment or death. The court convicted most of the defendants. Some received prison sentences, while 2 Germans were sentenced to death. Yet political pressure soon changed the outcome. The French government granted amnesty to the Alsatian conscripts only days after the verdict, leading to outrage among the families of the victims in Oradour-sur-Glane. The decision remains controversial even today. Justice, in many cases, was incomplete. Some members of Das Reich died during the war. Some spent years in prisoner of war camps. A small number were prosecuted. But many were never identified, never arrested, or never brought before a court. Destroyed records, Cold War politics, and the passage of time made comprehensive prosecutions increasingly difficult. Meanwhile, the SS itself faced judgment. During the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, the Schutzstaffel, or SS, was declared a criminal organization because of its central role in war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the Holocaust. The ruling recognized the organization's systematic involvement in Nazi atrocities. However, the tribunal did not automatically convict every individual member. Prosecutors still had to establish personal responsibility for specific crimes. Today, the ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane remain exactly as they were left in June 1944. Burned-out cars still sit where they were abandoned. Destroyed homes, workshops, and the remains of the village church stand as silent reminders of what happened. The site has been preserved as a memorial so future generations can witness the consequences of hatred, extremism, and unchecked power. The story of Das Reich is therefore not one of simple justice. The division suffered devastating losses on the battlefield. Germany was defeated. The Nazi regime collapsed. The SS was condemned by history. Yet many of the individuals responsible for crimes against civilians never fully answered for their actions in court. In the end, what Das Reich truly paid was not a single legal sentence, but the permanent destruction of its reputation. Its military achievements have been overshadowed by the atrocities committed in occupied Europe. Today, the name Das Reich is remembered not for tactical victories, but for Tulle, Oradour-sur-Glane, and the innocent lives that were lost. More than 80 years later, historians continue to study these events, not to glorify the division, but to understand how ideology, obedience, and war combined to produce some of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. The preserved ruins, surviving testimonies, and historical records ensure that the victims are remembered, and that the crimes committed by the men of Das Reich are never forgotten.